Hey guys, it's me, Miss Norris, and today I'd like to share a fun read aloud with you of the story Ruby the Copycat. The story Ruby the Copycat was written in 1991 by Peggy Rathmann, and it tells the story of Ruby and starting a new school. If you're ready to hear the story, I'm ready to share it with you. Here we go. Ruby the Copycat. Oh, it looks as though I'm copying Ruby today. She has a checkered dress with a red jacket, and so do I. I wonder if that's a good thing or a bad thing. We'll find out. Monday was Ruby's first day in Miss Hart's class. Class, this is Ruby, announced Miss Hart. Ruby, you may use the empty desk behind Angela. Angela is the girl with the pretty red bow in her hair. And Angela smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Angela's bow and tiptoed to her seat. So this is Miss Hart, this is Ruby, and this is Angela with the pretty red bow in her hair. And Angela has smiled at Ruby, and Ruby has smiled at Angela's bow. I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend, said Miss Hart. Does anyone have something to share? I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding, said Angela. That's exciting, said Miss Hart. Ruby raised her hand halfway. I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding, too. What a coincidence, said Miss Hart. Angela turned and smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at the top of Angela's head. Class, please take out your reading books, said Miss Hart. So Angela was excited to share that she was in her sister's wedding, and Ruby said that she was in her sister's wedding too. And when Angela smiled at her, Ruby still smiled at that bow at the top of her head. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped all the way home on one foot. When Ruby came back to school, she was wearing a red bow in her hair. She slid into her seat behind Angela. I like your bow, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. Class, please take out your math books, said Miss Hart. So Ruby went home and she liked Angela's bow so much that she put her own red bow on. And Angela said, I like your bow. And Ruby said, I like your bow too. On Tuesday morning, Angela wore a sweater with daisies on it. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped home sideways. When Ruby came back to school after lunch, she was wearing a sweater with daisies on it. I like your sweater, whispered Angela. I like yours too, whispered Ruby. So in the morning, Ruby came and she was wearing her own dress, and she's noticed Angela's purple sweater with daisies on it. And after she hopped home sideways, she came back with her own purple sweater with flowers on it. And Angela said, I like your sweater. I like yours too. So they both liked each other's sweaters. We can see that Ruby's flowers are attached with clothespins, safety pins. So we know that Ruby liked Angela's sweater so much that she made her own. On Wednesday, Angela wore a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. After lunch, Ruby hopped back to school wearing a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. Why are you sitting like that? Whispered Angela. Wet paint, said Ruby. So the next day at lunch, Ruby went home and she made her own rainbow shirt and rainbow shoes. Then she had to sit funny because the paint was still wet. On Thursday morning, during sharing time, Angela modeled the flower girl dress she wore in her sister's wedding. Ruby modeled her flower girl dress too, right after lunch. Angela didn't whisper anything. So this time on Thursday, Angela showed her very special dress that she got to wear in her sister's wedding. And after lunch, Ruby made her own dress. And this time, I think Angela's got a little, she doesn't think that it's that neat this time. She didn't say anything. By coincidence, on Friday morning, both girls wore red and lavender striped dresses. At lunchtime, Angela raced home. When Angela came back to school, she was wearing black. So on Friday, they both just wore the same outfit by accident. So instead of Ruby going home and changing into what Angela was wearing, Angela went home and she changed into the opposite of what Ruby was wearing. Maybe she doesn't think that it's so neat that she's being copied anymore. On Friday afternoon, Miss Hart asked everyone to write a short poem. Who would like to read first? Asked Miss Hart. Angela raised her hand. She stood by her desk and read, I had a cat I could not see because it stayed in back of me. It was a very loyal pet. It's sad we never really met. Well, that's very good, said Miss Hart. Now, who's next? Miss Hart looked around the room. Ruby? So Angela stood up and she read her poem about a cat that always stayed behind her. And then Miss Hart said, maybe Ruby, would you like to go next? Ruby stood and recited slowly. I had a nice pet who I never met because it always stayed behind me, and I'm sure it was a cat too. Ruby smiled at the back of Angela's head. Someone whispered. Ruby sat down. What a coincidence, murmured Miss Hart. So she tried to copy Angela's poem, but it didn't really go as planned. And now someone is whispering, and Miss Hart is trying to be thoughtful and kind and say, oh, that is a good coincidence. But I'm not sure if she thinks it is. Angela scribbled something on a piece of paper. She passed it to Ruby. The note said, You copied me. I'm telling Miss Hart. P.S. I hate your hair that way. Ruby buried her chin in the collar of her blouse. A big tear rolled down her nose and plopped onto the note. When the bell rang, Miss Hart sent everyone home except Ruby. So Angela got a little mad. She wrote a note that's all caps. She caps locked that. That means that she's shouting that you copied me. I am telling the teacher, and I don't like your hair that way. And that was kind of it. It made Ruby cry. And at the end of the day, Miss Hart sent everyone home, but she asked Ruby to stay. You think Ruby's in trouble? Miss Hart closed the door of the schoolroom and sat on the edge of Ruby's desk. Ruby, dear, she said gently, you don't need to copy everything Angela does. You can be anything you want to be. But be Ruby first. I like Ruby. Miss Hart smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Miss Hart's beautiful polished fingernails. "Have a nice weekend," said Miss Hart. "Have a nice weekend," said Ruby. So Miss Hart said, "You don't always have to do the same thing as Angela. Do whatever what Ruby likes to do." And then Ruby noticed Miss Hart's fingernails. They were polished and she loved them. Then she said, "Have a good weekend." On Monday morning, Miss Hart said, "I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend. I did. I went to the opera." Miss Hart looked around the room. "Does anyone have something to share?" Ruby waved her hand. Glued to every finger was a pink plastic fingernail. "I went to the opera too," said Ruby. "She did not," whispered Angela. Miss Hart folded her hands and looked very serious. "Ruby, dear," said Miss Hart gently, "did you do anything else this weekend?" So she's put on some fingernails to be like Miss Hart. And when Miss Hart said that she went to the opera, Ruby said, "I did too." And instead of getting angry, Miss Hart just says, "Ruby, is there anything else you did this weekend? Because what else did you do besides go to that opera? I'd like to know more about Ruby." Ruby peeled off a fingernail. "I hopped," said Ruby. The class giggled. Ruby's ears turned red. "But I did. I hopped around the picnic table 10 times. Ruby looked around the room. "Watch." So Ruby picked off her fingernails while she was thinking. And then finally, after she's picked off all of her fingernails, she says, I hopped. I hopped around a table 10 times. And when the other kids laughed, she said, "Look, watch, I'm going to show you." Ruby sprang from her desk. She hopped forward. She hopped backward. She hopped sideways with both eyes shut. Forwards, backwards, sideways with both eyes shut. The class cheered and clapped their hands to the beat of Ruby's feet. Ruby was the best hopper they had ever seen. Miss Hart turned on the tape player and said, "Follow the leader, do the Ruby hop." So Ruby led the class around the room while everyone copied her. So Ruby just had to find what she was great at. And now instead of Ruby copying others, the others are copying Ruby. And at noon, Ruby and Angela hopped home for lunch. The end. You can see they're having some fun together. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the story Ruby the Copycat. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button at the bottom of the page. If you are already a subscriber, thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot to me. If you're not a subscriber yet, please click that subscribe button down there at the bottom of the page. And don't forget to click the bell so that you're notified when there's new content. I hope to see you all again real soon. And remember, be yourself, and people might copy you. I'll hope to see you all real soon. Bye-bye.